Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her family. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she was the girl who helped her grandmother with groceries, who tutored struggling classmates in math, and who never raised her voice even when her younger brother borrowed her car without asking. At 5 feet 3 inches tall, with gentle brown eyes and a soft-spoken manner, nobody ever imagined that Sarah would one day become someone that hardened military officers would speak of in hushed, respectful tones. The transformation began on a Tuesday morning in September 2019, when Sarah walked into the Army recruitment office in downtown San Antonio. She had just turned 22, fresh out of college with a degree in computer science, and drowning in student loan debt. Her grandmother, Maria, had been diagnosed with cancer the month before, and the medical bills were piling up faster than Sarah's entry-level job at a local tech company could handle. "I want to enlist," she told Sergeant Williams, the recruiter who looked surprised to see such a petite, soft-spoken young woman walk through his doors on a quiet Tuesday. "What's your motivation?" Sergeant Williams asked, leaning back in his chair as he studied Sarah's earnest face. "My family needs help with medical expenses, and I want to serve my country," Sarah replied simply. "I have a computer science degree. I thought maybe I could be useful in cybersecurity or something technical." Sergeant Williams nodded approvingly. The military was always looking for people with technical skills, especially young women who could help diversify the traditionally male-dominated tech units. What he didn't know, as he handed Sarah the preliminary paperwork, was that he was looking at someone who would redefine what it meant to be a soldier in the digital age. Sarah's basic training at Fort Moore was unremarkable in most ways. She struggled with the physical requirements initially, often finishing last in runs and barely meeting the minimum standards for push-ups. Her drill sergeant saw her as dedicated but unremarkable, someone who would probably end up behind a desk somewhere, writing code and maintaining computer systems. They weren't wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. What they didn't see was how Sarah approached every challenge with methodical precision. While other recruits complained about the early morning wake-ups, Sarah used the extra time to study military protocols and procedures. While others struggled with the technical aspects of their weapons training, Sarah memorized every component, every function, every possible malfunction, and its solution. She didn't just want to pass her tests. She wanted to understand every system she encountered from the ground up. It was during her advanced individual training at Fort Gordon that Sarah first caught the attention of someone who mattered. Captain Rodriguez was teaching a course on network security when Sarah raised her hand during a routine lecture about firewalls. "Sir, what about quantum encryption protocols?" Sarah asked quietly. "Aren't we vulnerable to quantum computing attacks with our current systems?" The room fell silent. Captain Rodriguez paused, looking at the young private who had just asked a question that most graduate students in cybersecurity wouldn't think to ask. "What do you know about quantum encryption, Private Martinez?" he asked. Sarah straightened in her chair. "I wrote my senior thesis on post-quantum cryptography, sir. The Chinese and Russians are both heavily investing in quantum computing research. If they achieve quantum supremacy in the next decade, most of our current encryption methods will be obsolete." After class, Captain Rodriguez called Sarah to his office. "Private Martinez, how would you like to be part of something special?" That conversation led to Sarah's assignment to the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade's Cyber Operations Group, a unit so classified that most soldiers didn't even know it existed. Sarah thought she was being assigned to routine network maintenance and cybersecurity monitoring. She had no idea that she was about to become part of the most advanced cyber warfare unit in the United States military. The 780th was housed in an unremarkable building on Fort Gordon, surrounded by other equally unremarkable buildings that handled routine military communications. But beneath the surface, the 780th was fighting a war that most people didn't even know was happening. Every day, foreign governments, terrorist organizations, and criminal hackers launched thousands of attacks against American military networks, infrastructure systems, and government databases. The 780th's job was to stop them and, when necessary, to strike back. Sarah's first assignment was monitoring network traffic for suspicious activity. It was tedious work, staring at screens full of data logs and looking for patterns that might indicate an intrusion attempt. Most soldiers found it mind-numbing, but Sarah discovered that she had an intuitive understanding of network behavior that her supervisors found remarkable. She sees things that our automated systems miss. Major Thompson told his commanding officer after Sarah's first month. Yesterday, she identified a zero-day exploit that had been sitting in our networks for 3 weeks. Our best detection software never flagged it. Sarah's reputation grew quickly within the small, tight-knit community of the 780th. She worked 18-hour days voluntarily, not because she was ordered to, but because she found the work fascinating. Every attack was a puzzle to be solved. Every intrusion attempt a mystery to unravel. She started keeping detailed notes on attack patterns, creating her own database of hacker signatures and techniques. Her breakthrough came 6 months into her assignment, during what became known as the Thanksgiving Crisis. On November 27, 2020, while most of America was settling down to turkey and football, a sophisticated group of hackers launched a coordinated attack against 17 critical infrastructure targets across the United States. Power grids in Texas and California flickered. Water treatment plants in Florida and Ohio reported system malfunctions. Air traffic control systems at major airports began showing erratic readings. The attack was unlike anything the cybersecurity community had seen before. Instead of the usual brute force methods or known exploit techniques, the hackers were using something entirely new. They had found a way to make their malicious code look like routine system updates, allowing them to slip past even the most sophisticated detection systems. Sarah was on duty that night, one of only 3 analysts monitoring the networks when the first alert started coming in. While her colleagues began following standard protocols, calling in additional personnel, and implementing defensive measures, Sarah did something different. She started tracing the attack code back to its source. "Martinez, what are you doing?" Lieutenant Collins asked, noticing that Sarah's screen showed activity that wasn't part of the standard response procedures. "I'm following them home," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off her screen. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she traced the attack vectors through a maze of proxy servers and encrypted tunnels. What Sarah discovered over the next 4 hours changed everything. The attack wasn't coming from a foreign government or a terrorist organization, as everyone had assumed. It was coming from a group of American citizens, former military contractors who had been laid off from defense jobs and had decided to demonstrate the vulnerability of the systems they had helped build. But, more importantly, Sarah had figured out how to stop them. By analyzing the attack code, she had discovered a vulnerability in the hackers' own systems. Instead of simply defending against the attack, Sarah realized she could turn their own weapons against them. "Sir," she said quietly to Major Thompson, who had arrived at the operations center as the crisis escalated, "I can shut them down. All of them. Right now." Major Thompson looked at the young private who had just made an extraordinary claim. "Explain." Sarah's explanation was technical and complex, but the essence was simple. She had found a way to reverse the hackers' own attack code and send it back to them, effectively turning their computers into paperweights and simultaneously gathering evidence of their identities and locations. That's not strictly defensive," Major Thompson said slowly. "That's an active cyber attack. I don't have authority to authorize that." "Sir," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but with an edge of urgency, "they're going to crash the power grid in California in approximately 15 minutes if we don't stop them. Defensive measures aren't working. They're too sophisticated." Major Thompson made a decision that would later earn him both commendation and criticism from his superiors. "Do it." Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard. Later, cybersecurity experts would describe what she did in those next few minutes as nothing short of brilliant. She didn't just stop the attack. She turned it into a trap. When hackers tried to execute the final phase of their assault, their own code rebounded on them like a boomerang, shutting down their systems and automatically transmitting their locations to law enforcement. The attack stopped at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time. By midnight, FBI agents were knocking on doors in 6 different states, arresting the perpetrators with evidence that had been automatically compiled by Sarah's reverse attack program. The next morning, as news outlets struggled to explain why a massive cyber attack had simply stopped in the middle of execution, Sarah was sitting in a conference room being debriefed by officers whose names she wasn't allowed to know. They asked her hundreds of questions about her methods, her training, her thought process. They wanted to understand how a 23-year-old soldier with 6 months of experience had accomplished something that teams of senior analysts have been unable to do. "Who taught you to do that?" asked a woman in civilian clothes who had introduced herself only as Ms. Chun. "Nobi, Mam Sarah repeated. I just looked at what they were doing and figured out how to do it back to them." Just like that. Sarah shrugged. "It's just code, ma'am. Code follows rules. If you understand the rules, you can break them, or make them work for you instead of against you." The debriefing lasted 3 days. When it was over, Sarah returned to her regular duties, monitoring network traffic and writing reports. But something had changed. Word of what she had done spread through the cybersecurity community like wildfire, though always in vague terms that protected operational security. A young soldier had single-handedly stopped a major attack using techniques that no one had seen before. In a world where cyber warfare was becoming increasingly important, that kind of innovation was invaluable. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she was about to be recruited for something far more challenging than anything she had experienced so far. Deep in the Pentagon, a small group of officers were planning operations that would require exactly her kind of unconventional thinking. They were looking for someone who could go beyond traditional cybersecurity, someone who could take the fight directly to America's enemies in cyberspace. They were looking for someone who could become a weapon. 3 weeks after the Thanksgiving crisis, Sarah received orders transferring her to a new unit. The orders were classified, with a destination listed only as Fort Meade, Maryland, Special Assignment. She had no idea that Fort Meade was home to the National Security Agency and that her new assignment would put her at the center of America's most sensitive cyber operations. As Sarah packed her few belongings in her small apartment near Fort Gordon, she thought about how much her life had changed since that Tuesday morning when she had walked into the recruitment office. She was no longer the quiet girl who had just wanted to help her grandmother pay medical bills. She was becoming something else, though she didn't yet have a name for what that was. The night before her departure, Sarah called her grandmother in Texas. "How are you feeling, Abuela?" she asked. "Much better, Mija," Maria replied in her warm voice. "The doctors say the treatment is working, and the insurance is covering everything now, thanks to your military benefits." "I'm glad," Sarah said, feeling a familiar tightness in her throat. "I'm getting transferred to a new assignment. I might not be able to call as often." "You do what you need to do, Mija," Maria said. "I'm proud of you. We all are." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her small apartment, looking out at the Georgia night sky. She had joined the military to help her family and serve her country. She was accomplishing both goals, but in ways she had never imagined. Tomorrow she would begin a new phase of her life, one that would take her places she had never dreamed of going. She had no idea that within 2 years, she would be known in certain circles by a code name that would make hardened military officers straighten their shoulders and lower their voices in respect. She couldn't imagine that the quiet girl from Texas would become someone that foreign intelligence agencies would spend millions of dollars trying to identify and locate. Sarah Martinez was about to become Black Viper, though she wouldn't learn that name for quite some time yet. Fort Meade, Maryland, looked like any other military installation from the outside, but Sarah quickly learned that appearances could be deceiving. The building she was directed to was a modern glass structure that seemed more suited to a technology company than a military base. The sign outside simply read Information Systems Command, which told her nothing about what actually happened inside. Her new commanding officer was Colonel Patricia Hayes, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had spent her entire career in military intelligence. Colonel Hayes had personally reviewed Sarah's file and requested her transfer, though she didn't explain this during their first meeting. Private Martinez, Colonel Hayes said as they sat at her office overlooking a courtyard filled with satellite dishes. Your work on the Thanksgiving incident was impressive. But that was child's play compared to what we do here. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, unsure what else to say. Have you ever heard of advanced persistent threats? Colonel Hayes asked. Sarah nodded. Sophisticated, long-term cyber attacks, usually state-sponsored. They establish persistent access to networks and remain undetected for months or years while gathering intelligence. Correct. And have you ever considered what it would take to not just defend against such attacks, but to conduct them ourselves? The question hung in the air for a moment. Sarah realized that Colonel Hayes was asking her about offensive cyber operations, something that existed in a gray area between traditional warfare and espionage. I imagine it would require deep understanding of target systems, patience, and the ability to think several steps ahead of defensive measures, Sarah said carefully. Colonel Hayes smiled. Exactly. Welcome to Cyber Mission Force Team Alpha. Your real education starts now. The next 6 months were unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her life. Her days began at 0500 with physical training that was far more demanding than basic training had been. The military had learned that cyber warfare operatives needed to be as physically resilient as traditional soldiers, since their missions could require them to work for days without sleep under extreme pressure. But the physical training was just the beginning. Sarah found herself in classrooms, learning about foreign government structures, economic systems, and military capabilities. She studied Chinese, Russian, and Arabic, developing enough fluency to read technical documents and understand conversations. She learned about social engineering, the art of manipulating people into revealing information or providing access to systems they were supposed to protect. Most importantly, she learned about attribution, the science of figuring out who was responsible for a cyber attack. In the digital world, attackers could route their activities through dozens of countries and make themselves nearly impossible to trace. But nearly impossible wasn't the same as impossible, and Sarah discovered that she had an intuitive talent for following digital breadcrumbs back to their source. Her instructor for advanced penetration techniques was a civilian contractor named Dr. Marcus Webb, a former NSA analyst who had been conducting cyber operations since before most people knew what the internet was. Dr. Webb was the first person to really understand what made Sarah special. Most people think about cyber attacks like breaking into a house, Dr. Webb explained during one of their training sessions. They look for unlocked doors or open windows. But you think about it differently, don't you? Sarah considered his question. I think about it like understanding the house, so well that I can predict where the weak points will develop before the owners know they exist. Exactly, Dr. Webb said, nodding approvingly. You don't just find vulnerabilities. You understand systems well enough to create vulnerabilities where none existed before. It was during this training period that Sarah first encountered the concept of zero-day exploits, previously unknown vulnerabilities in software systems that could be used to gain unauthorized access. Finding zero-day exploits was considered one of the most valuable and difficult skills in cybersecurity. Some hackers spent months or years searching for a single zero-day vulnerability. Sarah found her first one during a training exercise in her 3rd month at Fort Meade. The exercise was designed to test the student's ability to penetrate a simulated network representing a foreign government's communication system. The network had been designed by NSA experts and was considered extremely difficult to breach. Most students were expected to spend weeks working on the problem. Sarah found a way in during her first afternoon. Ow! Dr. Webb asked when Sarah demonstrated her success. The network designers were very good at securing the important systems, Sarah explained, but they didn't pay enough attention to the temperature monitoring system for the server room. That system uses a default configuration that includes network access for remote monitoring. I was able to exploit that access to gradually work my way into more critical systems. Dr. Webb stared at his computer screen, where Sarah's intrusion path was displayed like a roadmap for the target network. That's brilliant. And It's exactly how real-world attackers think. It just seemed logical, Sarah said. People always forget about the auxiliary systems. Word of Sarah's natural talent spread quickly through the small community of Cyber Mission Force instructors. She wasn't just learning techniques, she was innovating new ones. Her training reports contained phrases like exceptional intuition and demonstrates understanding beyond her experience level. But it was her first real-world mission that truly established Sarah as something special. The mission came in the form of a crisis briefing on a cold December morning. Sarah and 3 other members of her training cohort were called into a secure conference room where Colonel Hayes waited with several officers they had never seen before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Hayes began, "we have a situation. 3 days ago, a group calling itself the Digital Liberation Army began conducting cyber attacks against American companies that do business with our allies in the Middle East. They've successfully breached the networks of 6 major corporations and are threatening to release sensitive customer data unless these companies cease their operations in the region." Sarah studied the information displayed on the room's large screen. The attacks showed sophisticated techniques and careful planning. This wasn't the work of script kiddies or amateur hackers. Intelligence suggests the group is based in Eastern Europe and may have state sponsorship, Colonel Hayes continued. Traditional law enforcement and diplomatic approaches aren't viable. We need to identify these attackers and neutralize their capability to continue their operations. "Ma'am," said Specialist Johnson, one of Sarah's classmates, "isn't this the kind of situation where we would coordinate with international law enforcement?" "Normally, yes," replied one of the unknown officers. "But the countries where these attackers are believed to be located have been less than cooperative with our previous requests. Sometimes we need to solve problems ourselves." Sarah understood. This was going to be an offensive cyber operation, possibly the first real one she had ever been involved in. The team was given 2 weeks to identify the attackers and develop a plan to neutralize them. Sarah threw herself into the task with an intensity that surprised even her. She spent 16 hours a day analyzing the attack patterns, studying the malware used in the breaches, and building a profile of the attackers' capabilities and methods. What she discovered was troubling. The Digital Liberation Army was far more sophisticated than the initial intelligence had suggested. Their attacks showed knowledge of American corporate networks that would be difficult for foreign hackers to acquire. Some of the techniques they were using were similar to methods she had seen in classified training materials. "Colonel Hayes," Sarah said during a briefing at the end of her first week of investigation, "I think we have a bigger problem than we initially thought." "Explain." Sarah had prepared a detailed presentation, but she decided to cut to the heart of the matter. "Ma'am, I believe at least some of these attackers are former American intelligence personnel. The techniques they're using aren't just sophisticated. They're specifically designed to exploit vulnerabilities in systems that American companies commonly use." The room fell silent. The implication of Sarah's analysis was serious. If former American intelligence officers were conducting cyber attacks against American companies, it represented a security breach with national implications. "How confident are you in this assessment?" Colonel Hayes asked. 70%, ma'am. There are signature patterns in their code that match techniques I've seen in our own training materials. Plus, they're targeting companies in a way that suggests they understand American corporate security practices from the inside. Over the next week, Sarah's analysis was verified by senior analysts. Not only were the attackers likely former American personnel, but they had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service and provided with resources to conduct their operations. The response plan that emerged from this intelligence was complex and sensitive. The team couldn't simply shut down the attackers' systems, because that would alert them that they had been discovered and might cause them to disappear before they could be properly identified. Instead, they needed to infiltrate the attackers' networks, gather intelligence about their identities and their foreign sponsors, and then coordinate with law enforcement to apprehend them. Sarah's role in the operation was to develop a way to invisibly penetrate the attackers' networks without triggering any of their security measures. It was a challenge that required her to think several steps ahead of highly trained adversaries who knew exactly what American cyber operators were capable of. The solution she developed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to attack the systems directly, Sarah found a way to hide malicious code inside routine software updates that the attacker's computers would automatically download. When the updates were installed, Sarah's code would activate and begin gathering information about the systems it was running on. It's like hiding a tracking device in something you know they'll take home with them, Sarah explained to her team. The operation launched on a Tuesday in January. Sarah's hidden code successfully infiltrated the attacker's networks and began transmitting information back to Fort Meade. Within 48 hours, the team had identified the physical locations of 7 individuals involved in the Digital Liberation Army operations. But Sarah discovered something else in the intelligence her code was gathering. The attackers weren't just going after American companies. They were planning something much larger. Colonel Hayes, Sarah said urgently during a late-night briefing, they're preparing to attack critical infrastructure. Power grids, water systems, transportation networks. This isn't about business pressure in the Middle East. This is preparation for something that looks like warfare. The intelligence Sarah had gathered showed that the Digital Liberation Army was a front organization for a much larger operation. Foreign intelligence services were using former American personnel to map and penetrate American infrastructure systems, gathering the access they would need to cause massive disruption if political tensions ever escalated to actual conflict. The discovery transformed the mission from a law enforcement operation into a matter of national security. Within days, Sarah found herself briefing officials whose names she had only seen in newspapers. The quiet girl from Texas was explaining cyber warfare tactics to some of the most senior military and intelligence officers in the American government. "How do we stop them?" asked a general whose uniform was covered with ribbons Sarah didn't recognize. "We turn their own operation against them," Sarah replied. "The same access they're using to map our systems can be used to feed them false information and monitor their activities. Instead of kicking them out, we let them think they're succeeding while we learn everything about their methods and objectives." It was a bold proposal. Instead of simply defending against the attack, Sarah was suggesting that they turn it into an intelligence-gathering opportunity. The operation she outlined would require months of careful management and carried significant risks. "And you can do this?" the general asked. Sarah looked around the room at the senior officers who were waiting for her answer. 6 months earlier, she had been a new recruit learning basic network security. Now, she was proposing to conduct one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations in cyber warfare history. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I can do it." The operation that followed would last 8 months and would ultimately expose an international cyber espionage network involving 3 foreign governments and dozens of former American intelligence personnel. Sarah's role evolved from technical analyst to operational leader, coordinating a complex deception that fed the attackers false information while systematically mapping their entire organization. It was during this operation that Sarah first heard the code name that would define the rest of her military career. She was working late one night when she overheard 2 senior officers talking in the hallway outside her office. "The Martinez operation is exceeding all expectations," one of them said. "She's remarkable," the other replied. "Strikes fast, disappears without a trace, and always finds the target's weakness. The folks at Langley are calling her Black Viper." Sarah pretended not to hear, but the name stuck with her. Black Viper. It sounded like something from a movie, not like the quiet girl who had grown up helping her grandmother with groceries. But as she looked at her computer screen, filled with data streams from around the world representing an operation she was conducting against foreign intelligence services, Sarah realized that maybe she wasn't that quiet girl anymore. Maybe she had become something else entirely. 2 years after the Digital Liberation Army operation, Sarah Martinez had officially become a ghost. Her military records showed a routine assignment to administrative support, classified, and Anyone who tried to look deeper would find themselves redirected to personnel who would politely explain that certain information was unavailable for security reasons. Sarah herself had been promoted to sergeant and then staff sergeant in rapid succession, though her actual rank within the cyber operations community was something entirely different. She now led a team of 12 specialists in what was officially designated as the Adaptive Threat Response Unit, though everyone who knew about it called it Black Viper's team. The codename had stuck, and Sarah had gradually come to accept it. In a world where identity could be a liability, having a reputation that preceded her actual name had certain advantages. The team operated out of a facility that didn't appear on any official maps, though it was hidden in plain sight within a government building in suburban Virginia. To anyone who might notice, they were just another group of IT workers maintaining computer systems. In reality, they were conducting some of the most sophisticated cyber operations in military history. Sarah's reputation had grown through a series of operations that seemed impossible until she accomplished them. There was the Tehran banking incident, where she had tracked a group of Iranian hackers through 7 layers of proxy servers and false identities, ultimately gathering enough evidence to expose an entire state-sponsored cyber warfare unit. There was Operation Digital Mongoose, where she had penetrated the networks of a North Korean missile development facility and fed them subtly corrupted data that set their program back by months. But it was the Shanghai revelation that truly established Sarah as a legend within the intelligence community. The operation began with intelligence indicating that Chinese military hackers had successfully penetrated the networks of 3 American defense contractors and were stealing plans for advanced fighter aircraft. Traditional countermeasures had failed to stop the intrusions, and the Pentagon was facing the possibility that America's next generation of military aircraft would be compromised before they ever flew. "We need to end this," General Morrison told Sarah during a briefing at the Pentagon. "These aren't random hackers looking for credit card numbers. This is systematic theft of military secrets that could affect the balance of power in the Pacific." Sarah studied the intelligence reports spread across the conference table. The Chinese operation was impressively sophisticated, using techniques she had never seen before and maintaining persistent access to the contractor networks without triggering any automated detection systems. "Sir," Sarah said, "shutting down their access to these specific networks won't solve the larger problem. They'll just find new ways in or target different companies. If we want to stop this, we need to attack the source." Explain. Sarah had been thinking about this problem for weeks since the first briefings began. The Chinese cyber warfare units operate differently than ours. They're more centralized, with critical operations running through specific facilities in Shanghai and Beijing. If we could compromise their command and control systems, we could not only stop this operation, but gather intelligence about all of their other activities. The general leaned back in his chair. "That would be an attack on Chinese military assets on Chinese soil. That's not a cyber operation, Sergeant. That's an act of war." "Only if they can prove it was us," Sarah replied quietly. "And only if we get caught." The room fell silent. Sarah was proposing to penetrate military networks inside China itself, something that would require her to overcome security measures designed by some of the best cyber warfare specialists in the world. If she failed, the diplomatic consequences could be severe. If she succeeded, the intelligence value would be enormous. "How would you do it?" the general asked finally. Sarah's plan was characteristically elegant and complex. Instead of trying to attack Chinese military networks directly, she would target the supply chain of software and hardware components used by Chinese cyber warfare units. By compromising systems before they reached their final destinations, she could establish access that would be virtually impossible to detect. The Chinese military uses specialized software developed by domestic companies, Sarah explained. Those companies purchase development tools and components from international suppliers. If we can compromise those tools, we can ensure that any software they create will have vulnerabilities we can exploit. It was a long-term approach that would require months of patient work. Sarah would need to identify the supply chains used by Chinese software companies, find ways to compromise their development tools, and then wait for the compromised tools to be used in the creation of software that would eventually be deployed on Chinese military networks. The operation began in March with Sarah's team targeting a software development company in Taiwan that provided programming tools to companies throughout Asia. It took 6 weeks to gain access to the company's networks and insert malicious code into their development software. The code was designed to be invisible to normal security scans and would only activate when the software was used to create programs for specific types of military applications. By summer, Sarah's compromised development tools have been used by 17 Chinese software companies, including 3 that provided systems directly to the People's Liberation Army's cyber warfare units. Sarah now had potential access to Chinese military networks, but she needed to activate that access carefully to avoid detection. The breakthrough came in August when Chinese hackers attempted another major penetration of American defense contractors. As they launched their attack, Sarah launched hers, using their own offensive operations as cover for her intrusion into their command systems. What Sarah discovered in the Chinese networks was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The Shanghai facility wasn't just coordinating attacks against American defense contractors. It was the command center for cyber operations against targets across the globe. Sarah found evidence of attacks against government networks in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India. She discovered plans for operations against critical infrastructure in Taiwan and the Philippines. Most importantly, she found detailed intelligence about Chinese cyber warfare capabilities, including information about vulnerabilities in Chinese systems that American forces could exploit if tensions ever escalated to actual conflict. "This is incredible," Colonel Hayes said as she reviewed Sarah's initial intelligence summaries. "You've effectively given us a complete picture of Chinese cyber warfare operations across the entire Pacific region." But Sarah wasn't finished. Having access to the Chinese command networks was just the beginning. She realized that she could use that access to disrupt Chinese operations without them realizing they had been compromised. Over the following months, Sarah conducted what she privately called ghost operations against Chinese cyber warfare activities. When Chinese hackers attempted to attack American targets, they would find that their tools mysteriously malfunctioned. When they tried to steal specific military secrets, they would instead receive carefully crafted false information designed to mislead Chinese military planning. The Chinese began to suspect that their operations were being disrupted, but they couldn't figure out how. Their networks showed no signs of intrusion, and their security protocols remained intact. They conducted extensive internal investigations, suspecting that they had a security leak or that their personnel had been compromised. Sarah watched these investigations through her access to their networks, adjusting her activities to stay ahead of their countermeasures. It was like playing chess with an opponent who couldn't see her pieces on the board. The Shanghai Revelation operation continued for over a year, during which Sarah's team gathered some of the most valuable intelligence on Chinese military capabilities that American forces had ever obtained. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah had demonstrated that cyber warfare could be conducted with a level of subtlety and sophistication that transformed it from a defensive tool into an instrument of strategic influence. "You've changed how we think about this entire domain," General Morrison told Sarah during a year-end briefing. "You're not just conducting cyber operations. You're reshaping the battlefield itself." It was around this time that Sarah began to understand the weight of the reputation she had built. During a routine coordination meeting with CIA representatives, she overheard a conversation that made her realize how far her legend had spread. "We've been tracking a series of sophisticated intrusions that seem to have government-level resources behind them," one CIA officer was explaining to another. "But every time we think we're getting close to identifying the operators, the trails go cold." "Sounds like Black Viper's work," the other officer replied. "If she's involved, you're not going to track her unless she wants you to." Sarah realized with a mixture of pride and unease that her reputation had reached the point where other American intelligence agencies were attributing unsolved cases to her, even when she hadn't been involved. The name Black Viper was becoming synonymous with cyber operations that seemed impossible until they happened. This reputation brought new challenges. Foreign intelligence services were desperately trying to identify the person behind the Black Viper codename. Sarah's security protocols had to be upgraded repeatedly as hostile agencies developed new methods for trying to unmask American cyber operatives. More personally, Sarah was struggling with the isolation that came with her role. Her family in Texas knew only that she worked in military intelligence and couldn't discuss her assignments. She had few friends outside of her professional circle, and those relationships were complicated by security restrictions that made normal social interaction difficult. During a rare visit home for Christmas, Sarah's grandmother noticed a change in her. "You seem different, Mija," Maria said as they sat in the kitchen where Sarah had grown up. "Older, more serious." "It's just the job, abuela," Sarah replied. "Military life changes people." "Are you happy?" Maria asked directly. Sarah considered the question. Was she happy? She was successful, respected by her colleagues, and contributing to national security in ways that most people couldn't imagine. But she was also living a life where her greatest accomplishments could never be publicly acknowledged, where her closest relationships were limited by security clearances, and where she sometimes went months without having conversation that wasn't related to military operations. "I'm doing important work," Sarah said finally. "Work that matters." Maria studied her granddaughter's face. "That's not the same as being happy." The conversation stayed with Sarah as she returned to her duties after the holidays. She began to wonder if the path she had chosen was sustainable in the long term. Could she build a life around a reputation that required her to remain invisible? Could she find personal fulfillment in work that could never be fully shared with anyone outside her professional circle? These questions became more pressing as Sarah's responsibilities continued to expand. She was now briefing senior officials regularly, her opinions were sought on matters of national cyber strategy, and her team was being tasked with increasingly sensitive operations. But it was a routine assignment that would soon test everything Sarah had learned about herself and her capabilities. The assignment seemed simple. Investigate reports of unusual network activity that might indicate a new type of cyber weapon being developed by an unknown adversary. What Sarah would discover in pursuing this investigation would challenge not only her technical skills, but her understanding of the ethical boundaries of cyber warfare. She was about to encounter an enemy who understood her methods as well as she did, and who was prepared to use that knowledge against her. The quiet girl from Texas who had become Black Viper was about to face the most difficult mission of her career, one that would force her to confront questions about the price of the reputation she had built and the person she had become in building it. As Sarah began her preliminary analysis of the unusual network activity, she had no way of knowing that she was about to enter a digital battlefield where the stakes were higher than anything she had previously encountered, and where the enemy was closer to home than she could possibly imagine. The briefing room at the Pentagon was more crowded than usual for a Tuesday morning. Sarah noticed immediately that the attendees included representatives from every major intelligence agency, several senior military officers she had never seen before, and a woman in civilian clothes who was taking notes on everything being said. Whatever this meeting was about, it was significant. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison began, "3 weeks ago, we began detecting unusual network activity across multiple sectors of critical infrastructure. At first, it appeared to be routine probing by known adversaries. However, our analysis has revealed something far more concerning." The large screen at the front of the room displayed a complex network diagram showing interconnections between power grids, financial systems, transportation networks, and communication infrastructure. Red lines highlighted areas where unusual activity had been detected. "What we're seeing isn't random exploration," the general continued. "Someone is systematically mapping the interconnections between our most critical systems, looking for cascade failure points where a single attack could cause widespread disruption." Sarah studied the diagram carefully. The pattern was sophisticated, showing an understanding of infrastructure vulnerabilities that would require extensive knowledge of American systems. But there was something else about the attack methodology that seemed familiar. "Sir," Sarah said, raising her hand slightly, "have we identified the source of these probes?" "That's why you're here, Sergeant Martinez," General Morrison replied. "Traditional attribution methods have failed. The attackers are using techniques we haven't seen before, and they're very good at covering their tracks." The CIA representative, a thin man with glasses who had introduced himself as Mr. Peterson, leaned forward. "We need Black Viper to work her magic on this one. If anyone can figure out who's behind this, it's her." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of pride and pressure that came with such statements. Her reputation had reached the point where people expected miracles from her, and she had delivered often enough that those expectations were usually justified. "I'll need complete access to all the intelligence we've gathered so far," Sarah said, "plus authorization to conduct active investigation operations." "You'll have whatever you need," General Morrison assured her. Sarah spent the next week diving deep into the intelligence reports and network logs from the infrastructure probing incidents. What she found was troubling in multiple ways. The attackers weren't just sophisticated. They seemed to understand American infrastructure systems from the inside. Their probing techniques targeted specific vulnerabilities that weren't widely known, and they moved through networks with a confidence that suggested extensive prior knowledge. More concerning was the methodology itself. Sarah recognized patterns in the attack techniques that reminded her of methods she had seen in classified American cyber operations. Someone was using tactics that looked suspiciously like her own. "Colonel Hayes," Sarah said during a briefing with her immediate supervisor, "I think we have a bigger problem than foreign intelligence gathering." "Explain." Sarah had prepared detailed analysis documents, but she decided to cut straight to her conclusion. "Ma'am, these attacks show knowledge of American systems that would be very difficult for foreign operatives to acquire. But more than that, the methodology shows familiarity with our own operational techniques." Colonel Hayes studied Sarah's analysis for several minutes before speaking. "Are you suggesting that American personnel are involved in these attacks?" "I'm suggesting that whoever is conducting these operations has access to classified information about both American infrastructure and American cyber warfare methods. That's a very short list of possibilities." The investigation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had previously experienced. Instead of hunting foreign adversaries, she found herself trying to trace the actions of people who might be her own colleagues or former colleagues. It was like trying to catch a reflection in a mirror. Every technique she used to track the attackers could theoretically be anticipated by someone who understood those same techniques. Sarah's first breakthrough came when she realized that the infrastructure mapping wasn't random. The systems being probed were all connected to a specific geographic region, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Someone was systematically identifying ways to disrupt critical services in and around the nation's capital. Her second breakthrough was more disturbing. While analyzing the timing of the attacks, Sarah discovered that they correlated with the schedules of specific government meetings and events. The probing activity increased before major congressional hearings, summit meetings with foreign leaders, and other significant political events. Someone is planning to use infrastructure attacks to influence political events, Sarah concluded during a briefing that now included representatives from the Secret Service and FBI. "This isn't espionage or general warfare preparation. This is targeting our democratic processes." The implications were staggering. If hostile actors could disrupt power, communications, or transportation in Washington, D.C. during critical political moments, they could potentially influence the outcome of legislation, international negotiations, or even elections. Sarah threw herself into the investigation with an intensity that worried her colleagues. She worked 18-hour days, sleeping in her office more often than in her apartment. She developed increasingly sophisticated tools to trace the attackers, creating programs that could follow digital footprints through layers of obfuscation that would have stopped traditional investigation methods. It was during one of these marathon investigation sessions that Sarah discovered something that made her blood run cold. Hidden in the network logs was evidence that someone had been watching her own activities. Not just her current investigation, but her previous operations going back years. Someone knew who Black Viper was. Someone had been tracking her methods, her targets, her successes, and that someone had been using that knowledge to develop countermeasures against her techniques. Sarah immediately implemented emergency security protocols, assuming that her communications and activities were being monitored. She began developing new investigation methods on isolated systems, sharing her progress only with Colonel Hayes through secure channels that hadn't been used for any previous operations. What she discovered over the next few days was a nightmare scenario that threatened everything she had worked to build. The infrastructure attacks weren't being conducted by foreign adversaries. They were being planned by a group of former American intelligence personnel who had intimate knowledge of both American systems and American cyber warfare capabilities. But this wasn't the Digital Liberation Army scenario again. This group was different. They weren't working for foreign governments. They were working for themselves, planning to use their cyber warfare capabilities to influence American political processes for their own purposes. The leader of the group, according to Sarah's investigation, was someone she knew personally. Dr. Marcus Webb, her former instructor at Fort Meade, had been recruiting former students and colleagues to join what he called a Shadow Patriot organization that would use cyber warfare to protect American interests from what he considered weak political leadership. They think they're saving the country, Sarah explained to General Morrison during a classified briefing. Dr. Webb has convinced them that American political leaders are too compromised or too weak to defend against foreign threats, so they're going to do it themselves. By attacking American infrastructure, by demonstrating American vulnerability, Sarah clarified. Their plan is to conduct limited attacks that expose infrastructure weaknesses, forcing the government to take stronger defensive measures. But they're also prepared to disrupt systems if they believe political decisions are threatening national security. The general was quiet for a long moment. And they've been tracking your activities? Yes, sir. Dr. Webb knows my methods better than almost anyone. He's been studying my operations and developing countermeasures. If he realizes I'm investigating his group, he'll disappear, and we'll lose our chance to stop them. The cat and mouse game that followed was the most challenging of Sarah's career. She had to investigate Dr. Webb's organization while avoiding detection by someone who understood her capabilities intimately. It required her to develop entirely new techniques and approaches, working with a small team of personnel who had never been associated with her previous operations. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that Dr. Webb's greatest strength was also his weakness. His detailed knowledge of her methods meant that he was focused on defending against techniques she had used before. But Sarah had been evolving her capabilities throughout her career, and there were approaches she had developed but never deployed operationally. Using these new techniques, Sarah was able to penetrate the communications network used by Dr. Webb's group without triggering any of the detection systems he had put in place. What she found was evidence of a plot that went far beyond infrastructure demonstration attacks. Dr. Webb's group was planning to disrupt the 2024 presidential election by attacking voting systems and communication networks in key states. They believed that by exposing the vulnerability of election infrastructure, they would force the implementation of stronger security measures and reduce reliance on electronic voting systems. They're not trying to change the outcome of the election, Sarah explained during an emergency briefing. They're trying to discredit the entire electoral process. They think they're protecting democracy by demonstrating how it can be attacked. The operation to apprehend Dr. Webb's group required coordination between multiple agencies and had to be executed simultaneously across several states. Sarah's role was to monitor their communications and ensure they couldn't destroy evidence or disappear when they realized they were being investigated. The arrest took place on a Thursday morning in October, just 3 weeks before the election. FBI agents apprehended 17 individuals across 6 states, including Dr. Webb and for other former NSA personnel. The evidence Sarah had gathered showed detailed plans for election system attacks and included communications discussing their willingness to cause temporary power outages to demonstrate infrastructure vulnerability. The investigation and arrests remained classified, with public announcements limited to routine statements about enhanced election security measures. Sarah's role in stopping the plot would never be publicly acknowledged, but within the intelligence community, the Black Viper legend grew even larger. It was 6 months later, during a routine staff meeting at a different government facility, that Sarah first witnessed the reaction her name had come to provoke. She was attending a joint training session between several cyber operations units, where she was introduced as a subject matter expert on advanced threat analysis. The meeting was led by a colonel she had never met, who was briefing the attendees on recent cyber threats facing American interests. "We've been tracking several sophisticated adversaries," the colonel explained, "but our biggest concern is the group that's been systematically dismantling foreign cyber operations against American targets. Intelligence suggests it's the work of a single operator or small team, but their capabilities seem almost superhuman." A young lieutenant raised her hand. "Sir, could this be the work of Black Viper?" The room fell silent. Sarah, sitting in the back row, watched as 35 military and civilian personnel suddenly straightened in their chairs and exchanged glances. "Where did you hear that name, Lieutenant?" the colonel asked quietly. "It's mentioned in several after-action reports I've read, sir, always in connection with operations that seemed impossible until they were completed." The colonel looked around the room, his expression serious. "Black Viper is not a topic for general discussion. If any of you have questions about specific operations or capabilities, you'll need to speak with your security officers." After the meeting, Sarah overheard conversations that made her realize how her reputation had evolved. Groups of junior officers were speculating about whether Black Viper was a single person or a code name for an entire unit. Some thought it might be a foreign operative who had been turned and was working for American interests. Others believed it was an artificial intelligence system that had achieved unprecedented capabilities. "I heard that foreign intelligence agencies have standing orders to avoid any operation if there's evidence of Black Viper involvement," one analyst said to another as they walked past Sarah in the hallway. Everyone laughed when she said, "Ask your general," Sarah thought to herself, remembering a comment she had overheard weeks earlier. The room froze at one name, Black Viper. Sarah realized that her reputation had reached a point where it was almost independent of her actual identity. The name Black Viper had become something larger than the quiet girl from Texas who had originally been given that code name. It represented an idea, the possibility that cyber warfare could be conducted with such precision and effectiveness that it seemed almost magical to those who didn't understand the technical details. That evening, Sarah called her grandmother for the first time in months. "How are you feeling, Abuela?" she asked. "Much better, Mija. The doctors say I'm completely healthy now. How are you? You sound tired." Sarah considered the question. She was tired, but it was more than physical exhaustion. She had spent years building a reputation that commanded instant respect and even fear within certain circles, but that reputation also isolated her from normal human connection. "I'm doing well," Sarah said finally. "My work has been challenging, but I think I'm making a real difference." "Are you happy?" Maria asked, the same question she had posed during Sarah's Christmas visit. This time, Sarah had a different answer. "I'm proud of what I've accomplished, Abuela, and I think you'll be proud too, even though I can't tell you the details." "I'm already proud of you, Mija," Maria replied warmly. "You've always been special. Even when you were little, you could figure out things that confused everyone else." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her apartment, looking out at the lights of the Virginia suburbs. She thought about the journey that had brought her from a small town in Texas to a position where her name was spoken in whispers in government buildings around the world. The quiet girl who had joined the military to help pay her grandmother's medical bills had become someone whose reputation could fill a room with tension and whose capabilities were the subject of speculation and legend within the intelligence community. Sarah Martinez had become Black Viper, But perhaps more importantly, Black Viper had become a symbol of what was possible when technical skill, strategic thinking, and unwavering dedication were combined in service of protecting the country she loved. In secure facilities around Washington, D.C., Sarah's colleagues continued their work of defending American interests in cyberspace, knowing that if they encountered something beyond their capabilities, there was someone they could call. Someone whose name made hardened military officers straighten their shoulders and speak more quietly. Someone who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapons in the digital age came not from the largest institutions or the most expensive technologies, but from the quiet determination of an individual who refused to accept that any challenge was impossible to overcome. The legend of Black Viper would continue to grow, but the person behind that legend remained what she had always been, a young woman from Texas who had discovered that she had the ability to see patterns that others missed, and who had chosen to use that ability in service of something larger than herself.